My son wrote, "Never come to our house for Christmas, my wife is angry with you." I smiled, because he didn't know the house belonged to me, and that same evening, he stood at my door. I remember the way the screen of my phone glowed in the dim light of my living room. It was December 18th, a Tuesday, and the peppermint bark I'd been making was cooling on the counter, filling the air with a sweetness that didn't match the ice in my chest. I read those words over and over. Never come to our house. Alice is angry. You ruin the vibe. It's a funny thing, isn't it? How a child you carried for 9 months and raised for 20 years can suddenly decide you're a stranger because a woman in a silk jumpsuit told him so. Most mothers would have cried. They would have called, begging for a chance to explain or apologizing for sins they didn't commit. But I just sat there, in Silas's old leather armchair, the one with the worn-out seat and the smell of tobacco still clinging to the headrest, and I took a long, slow sip of my tea. I didn't feel the urge to scream. I felt a strange sort of relief. For years, I had been holding on to a secret that was meant to be a gift, a final, grand gesture of love for my only son. But as I stared at that blue text bubble, I realized that some gifts aren't earned, they're expected. And when grace is treated like a right, it's time to remind people where that grace comes from. My son thought he was king of the castle. He forgot who owned the ground the castle was built on. Let's be honest with each other for a moment. Have you ever poured your entire life into someone, only for them to treat you like a piece of furniture they've outgrown? Have you ever sat at a table you paid for, eating food you provided, while someone looked at you like you were a stain on the rug? They say blood is thicker than water, but I've found that greed is stickier than both. People think that because you're older, you're softer. They think your memories are failing, and your backbone has turned to jelly. Alice certainly thought so. She thought my silence was permission. She thought my kindness was a green light to run me over. I know there are some of you watching this right now, who are dreading the holidays. You're worried about that one daughter-in-law who rolls her eyes when you speak, or the son who only calls when the bank account is empty. You've felt that hot prickle of shame when you're made to feel like a burden in your own family. I want you to know, you aren't alone. We've all seen cases like this, where the people we love the most become the ones we recognize the least. The problem isn't just a lack of respect, it's a theft of identity. Alice wasn't just trying to take my house, she was trying to erase my history. She wanted the vibe of a successful, high society life, without the decades of red dirt and hard work it took to get there. She wanted the crown without the scars. So, what do you do when the person you love tells you that you aren't welcome under the roof you bought? Do you stay home and cry into your eggnog? Or do you call your lawyer and remind them that rent to own is a legal contract, not a suggestion? I chose the latter. I decided right then, with the smell of peppermint still heavy in the air, that if I was going to ruin the vibe of Alice's Christmas, I might as well do it properly. I wasn't just staying home, I was taking the house with me. But before I tell you how a few sheets of paper turned a high society gala into a sidewalk fire sale, I need to ask you something. Subscribe to this channel right now, because the world is full of people like Alice, people who think they can take what you've built and kick you to the curb. If you don't stay informed, if you don't learn how to spot the signs of a predator in the family, you might be the next one receiving a text like that. Subscribe so you aren't caught off guard when the people you trust try to rewrite your story. And if you're still not subscribing, drop a comment below, tell me, what's holding you back? Are you waiting for your own Alice to show her teeth? Now, let me take you back to where this all started. Long before the gray gravel and the silk jumpsuits. Back to when Willow Creek Lane was nothing but woods and a dream. To understand why that text message felt like a physical blow, you have to understand the soil of Willow Creek Lane. In 1994, that part of Georgia wasn't the sprawling suburban paradise it is today. It was a rugged stretch of pines and stubborn clay that turned into a red river every time the sky opened up. Silas and I were young then, with more calluses on our hands than money in our pockets. Most people our age were moving toward the city, looking for paved streets and modern conveniences. They wanted the shiny new-build homes that looked like they were made of cardboard and hope. But Silas was a man who looked at a map and saw a future nobody else could see. He pointed to a patch of woods where the coyotes still outvoted the people and said, "Vicky, that's where we plant our flag. We didn't buy that land with a windfall or a loan from our parents. We bought it by skipping vacations for a decade. We bought it by driving cars that groaned every time we turned the key, and by wearing coats until the elbows were thin as tissue paper. When we finally closed on the property, we didn't hire a fancy firm to clear the lot. Silas spent his weekends out there with a chainsaw and a grit I haven't seen in a man since. I was right there beside him, hauling brush and staining wood, until my fingernails were permanently dark. We weren't just building a structure, we were carving a life out of the wilderness. That 4-bedroom craftsman wasn't a real estate asset to us. It was the physical proof that two people with a shared vision could build something that lasted. Every brick was laid with a conversation about our future. Every window was positioned to catch the morning sun just right. We knew every creak in the floorboards because we were the ones who hammered them down. In those days, a house was a vow you made to the land. For 40 years, that house was the heart of our world. It saw the messy, beautiful reality of a life well lived. It saw John's first steps on the oak floors Silas had sanded by hand. It saw the kitchen table where we sat through every recession, every family crisis, and every celebration. We weren't rich, but we were smart. We watched as the city began to crawl toward our borders. Developers started knocking on our door, offering sums of money that made my head spin, but Silas always sent them packing. "Vicky," he'd say, leaning against the porch railing we'd painted together 3 times over, "folks today want things fast and cheap. They want the look of success without the work. But land? Land is the only thing they aren't making more of. It's the only true power a regular person can hold on to." He taught me that real wealth isn't about what you spend, it's about what you keep. While our neighbors were trading up for larger houses with thinner walls, we stayed put. We poured our extra cash into the land, buying up the adjacent lots and ensuring that nobody could ever crowd us out. We were building a fortress, though we didn't know it then. We were making sure that no matter what happened in the outside world, the Jackson family had a place that was truly theirs. John grew up in the shade of those oak trees. He saw his father work until his back ached, to ensure that roof never leaked. He saw me scrub those floors on my knees because we couldn't afford a cleaning crew, and didn't want one anyway. I thought he was learning. I thought he was absorbing the value of a hard day's work, and the sanctity of a home. I didn't realize that while he saw the sweat, he wasn't feeling the heat. He was enjoying the shade, without understanding how long it takes for an oak tree to grow. The hardest day of my life wasn't the day I received that text from John. It was the rainy Tuesday 5 years ago, when Silas finally lost his battle, with a heart that had simply given everything it had to give. He was laying in our bedroom, the one overlooking the backyard, where the rose bushes were in full bloom. He was weak, his breath coming in shallow gasps, but his mind was clear as a mountain spring. He reached out and gripped my hand. His skin felt like old parchment, but his squeeze was firm. He pulled me close and whispered words that have echoed in my mind every single day since. "Vicky, keep the land. Don't let them talk you out of it. It's your power. It's the only thing that will keep you standing when the world tries to push you down." He wasn't talking about the money. He was talking about the dignity of ownership. He knew that the world has a way of trying to diminish a woman once she's on her own, especially an older woman. He wanted me to have a foundation that nobody could shake. When he passed away an hour later, I made a silent promise to him, and to that house. I would protect what we built. I would be the steward of our legacy. At the time, John was a mess of tears and grief. He held me, and promised he'd look after me, and for a while, I believed him. He was a soft-hearted boy, always quick to offer a hug, but slow to make a tough decision. I saw Silas's eyes in his face, but as the years went by, I started to notice the parts of his father he didn't inherit. He didn't have that iron in his blood. He didn't have the ability to say no when someone beautiful and demanding started whispering in his ear. When Alice Morrison entered the picture, I tried to be the welcoming mother. I tried to see what John saw. But the first time she stepped onto the porch of the Willow Creek house, she didn't look at the craftsmanship of the front door. She didn't ask about the history of the neighborhood. She looked at the crown molding in the acreage like she was calculating a commission. She didn't see a home. She saw a prize. And I should have known right then that a woman who only values the price tag will never respect the person who paid the bill. It happened on a Tuesday in early spring, the kind of day where the air smells like wet earth and new beginnings. I had driven over to the Willow Creek house with a tray of lemon squares, thinking I'd spend a quiet afternoon helping Alice prune the rose bushes. Those roses weren't just plants. My grandmother had brought the original clippings from her farm in North Carolina, in a damp burlap sack. I had spent 30 years coaxing them to climb the trellis Silas built, until they were a riot of deep crimson and soft pink that could be smelled from the end of the block. They were the living heartbeat of that yard. But as I pulled into the driveway, the smell of blossoms was gone. In its place was the sharp, dusty scent of crushed stone. I stepped out of my car and felt the world tilt. The trellis was gone. The bushes, the ones that had survived droughts, ice storms, and the rough and tumble play of John's childhood, had been hacked down to the dirt. In their place, a crew of men was spreading thick layers of sterile, slate-gray gravel. It looked like a parking lot for a funeral home. I stood there, the warm lemon squares heavy in my hands, feeling a coldness spread through my limbs. It felt like someone had taken a knife to my family tree. Those roses had seen my son's graduation photos. They had been the backdrop for every summer barbecue Silas and I ever hosted. By ripping them out, Alice wasn't just changing the landscaping. She was announcing that my history was something to be cleared away like common weeds. She was stripping the soul out of the land to make room for a trend she'd seen in a magazine. Alice walked out of the front door, holding a clipboard like she was supervising a construction site instead of a home. She was wearing a crisp white blouse that looked like it had never seen a day of real work. When she saw me, that honey-thick voice of hers slid through the air. "Oh, Mother Vicky, don't you just love it? It's so much more modern. The old way was just so heavy. All that color was so distracting. This creates a much more curated aesthetic." I looked at the gray stones. I looked at the empty space where my grandmother's legacy used to grow. "Alice," I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to keep it steady. "Those were heirloom roses. They've been in this family for 3 generations." She gave me a look that was half pity and half annoyance, the kind of look you give a child who doesn't understand why they can't have candy for dinner. "Vicky dear, we have to think about the property value. Nobody wants to spend their weekends weeding in thorns. This is low-maintenance luxury. It's what people of our station expect these days." I realized then that to Alice, the house was just a stage, and I was an extra who had stayed on the set too long. She began explaining her plans to paint the oak banisters, the ones Silas had spent 6 months sanding and staining, a dull, flat gray. She talked about lightening the mood, as if 40 years of love and laughter had made the house too dark. Every word she spoke was an insult to the man who built those walls. She was curating a life that had no room for the people who actually lived it. I want to pause here and ask you something. Have you ever stood by and watched while someone destroyed something you spent years building? Maybe it wasn't a garden. Maybe it was a business you started from your garage, or a reputation you spent decades protecting. Have you ever had someone walk into your life and tell you that your hard-earned traditions were cluttered or outdated? It's a specific kind of ache, isn't it? It's the feeling of being told that your sacrifices don't matter because they don't fit someone else's vibe. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done in my shoes? Would you have screamed right there on that gray gravel? Or would you have done what I did? I didn't argue. I didn't let her see the tears that were burning the backs of my eyes. I just set the lemon squares down on a stone pillar and walked back to my car. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw John coming around the side of the house. He looked at the gravel, then at Alice, and then he just shrugged. He didn't even notice the roses were gone. He was so busy trying to fit into the gray world she was building that he'd forgotten the color of his own childhood. I realized that afternoon that Alice wasn't just weeding the flower beds. She was weeding me out of the family. She wanted a clean slate, a life with no roots and no obligations to the past. But she forgot one very important thing about roots. Just because you cut them off at the surface doesn't mean the property belongs to you. You can lay all the gravel in the world, but the dirt underneath still remembers who planted the seeds. And I was the one who held the deed to every inch of that dirt. By the time the heat of summer settled over Georgia, the house on Willow Creek Lane had become a stranger to me. I would drive by sometimes, just to see if the oak trees were still standing, and every time I did, another piece of my life had been erased. The beautiful, warm honeytones of the exterior trim had been covered in a shade Alice called urban pebble, which was just a fancy way of saying the color of a rainy sidewalk. But the real blow came when I was finally allowed inside for a brief, 20-minute visit. Silas had spent 6 months of his life on the grand staircase. He had sanded those oak banisters until they felt like silk under your palm. He used to say that the wood had a pulse if you listened close enough. When I walked through the door, I reached out to touch that familiar grain, but my hand met something cold and plastic feeling. Alice had painted over the oak. She had covered 40 years of craftsmanship with a flat, lifeless gray. "It really opens up the space, doesn't it?" Alice asked, not really looking at me. She was busy rearranging some minimalist vases on the mantel where my family photos used to sit. The wood was just so heavy. It made the house feel like a museum. We wanted it to feel like our home, not a relic of the past. I looked at the walls where the heights of my grandchildren were supposed to be marked. I looked at the floors where the scuffs of John's toy trucks had been buffed away and covered with expensive, soulless rugs. Every time Alice used the word we, it felt like a door slamming in my face. She wasn't just decorating. She was performing an exorcism. She was removing every trace of the woman who had actually paid for the roof over her head. The isolation wasn't sudden. It didn't arrive with a bang. It arrived with a series of forgotten phone calls and misplaced invitations. Suddenly, the Sunday dinners that had been a tradition for decades became too complicated to organize. Alice would post photos on her social media, which my friend Beatrice would show me later, of grand garden parties and intimate wine tastings. I was never in the pictures. When I would call John to ask why I hadn't heard about the 4th of July barbecue, his voice would sound tight and hurried. "Oh, Mom, Alice thought you were busy with your church group." It was mostly just her work friends anyway. You would have been bored. I wasn't bored. I was being erased. I was being treated like a distant relative who was tolerated but not invited. Alice started making comments about my small apartment, suggesting that I was lucky to have downsized so I wouldn't have to worry about the responsibilities of a real estate property. She spoke as if she had rescued the house from my incompetence. She truly believed that because she sat at the head of the table, she had earned the right to decide who sat next to her. She was building a wall of glass and gray paint between me and my son. John, ever the doormat, just let it happen. He watched his mother be pushed to the margins of his life and called it giving Alice space to grow. He didn't realize that the more space he gave her, the less room there was for him to be a man of his own word. There is a specific kind of fear that keeps you awake at 3 a.m. when you reach a certain age. It's not the fear of getting older or the fear of being alone. It's the fear of being replaced while you're still standing right there. It's the realization that the people you built a world for are busy building a new one that doesn't include you. I want you to look at your own life for a second. Have you noticed the signs? The way your advice is suddenly treated like a nuisance? The way your history is rewritten to make you look like a bystander in your own success? This is how it starts. People like Alice don't take everything at once. They take it inch by inch, room by room, until you're a stranger in your own skin. Subscribe to her revenge right now, because if this happened in your town tomorrow, wouldn't you want to know how to fight back? Most people don't see the danger coming until they're already locked out of the room. Don't let yourself be caught off guard. Subscribe so you can learn the difference between being a sweet grandma and being a woman who knows exactly where the deed is hidden. If you're still not hitting that button, tell me in the comments. Do you think I should have spoken up sooner? Or was I right to let her hang herself with her own silk rope? Alice thought she was winning because I was quiet. She thought my silence meant I had accepted my station in life. But I wasn't fading away. I was observing. I was watching her spend thousands of dollars on a house that didn't belong to her. And I was waiting for the moment the foundation would finally crack. And let me tell you, when you've spent 40 years building a home, you know exactly which brick to pull to make the whole thing come tumbling down. Thanksgiving in Georgia used to mean something. It meant the smell of sage and slow-roasted turkey, clinging to the curtains for a week. It meant a table extended with every spare leaf we owned to accommodate cousins, neighbors, and anyone who didn't have a place to go. This year, I spent 3 days in my kitchen, my back aching, and my hands stained from chopping onions and celery. I made my signature cornbread, dressing the recipe Silas loved, the one with the perfect golden crust and the center that melted like butter. I'd glazed a honey ham until it shone like a jewel. When I pulled up to the Willow Creek house, my arms were heavy with steaming trays, wrapped in thick towels. I expected the door to swing wide, for John to rush out and help me with the load, but the house stood silent behind its new gray facade. When I managed to ring the bell with my elbow, the door opened only a few inches. Alice stood there, dressed in an expensive cream-colored silk jumpsuit that cost more than my first 3 cars combined. She didn't look at my face. She looked at the trays in my arms, as if I were holding a bucket of industrial waste. "Oh, Vicky," she sighed, her voice carrying that sharp, artificial sweetness that always made my teeth ache. "We actually went organic this year. I've had the entire meal catered from that new bistro downtown, the one with the Michelin star chef. Their menu is very clean, very refined. That heavy, salty stuff you make just doesn't fit our lifestyle anymore. It's a bit rustic for the guests we're hosting." She didn't reach for the trays. She didn't even step back to let me in. She stood in the gap of the door, checking her watch. "But, I suppose you can take it around to the kitchen. The help might want some for the leftovers. Just try not to get any grease on the new marble counters, okay?" I felt a heat rise in my neck that had nothing to do with the steaming dressing. I walked past her, seeing John standing by the fireplace in a sweater that looked too tight for his frame. He caught my eye for a fleeting second, then looked down at his glass of sparkling water. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He let his mother carry the weight, while his wife treated me like a delivery driver. The dining room was a sea of faces. I didn't recognize people with expensive haircuts and names that sounded like law firms. At the head of the table sat Alice's mother, a woman named Beatrice, who wore so much perfume, the air felt heavy and flammable. She sat in Silas's chair. That was the spot where a man of honor used to sit, telling jokes and carving the bird with a steady hand. Now, it was occupied by a woman who spent the first 10 minutes of the meal complaining about the limited vintage of the wine. "It's just such a blessing," Beatrice announced, waving a fork at the gray-painted walls, "that Alice and John were able to secure a property with such historical charm. Most young couples have to settle for something so suburban, but owning a grand estate like this outright, it gives them so much leverage in their social circle." Alice beamed, sipping her wine like she was the queen of the county. "It really does, Mother. We're already talking to architects about knocking out the back wall for a floor-to-ceiling glass sunroom. We want to maximize the footprint. It's all about the equity now." I sat at the far end of the table, pickling in my own silence. I looked at the organic turkey on my plate. It was dry, gray, and tasted like cardboard. And then I looked at my son. "Leverage, Alice?" I asked, my voice cutting through the chatter about country clubs and interior designers. "You haven't even finished paying the installments for the rent-to-own agreement this year. That seems like a strange time to be knocking down walls." The table went silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the expensive new rugs. Alice's eyes turned into 2 pieces of cold flint. She set her glass down with a deliberate click. "Vicky, let's not be gauche. Discussing money at the dinner table is for people who don't have any. Besides, John and I consider this our home in every way that matters. The paperwork is just a formality for the lawyers, isn't it?" I turned to my son. "Is it, John? Is your father's legacy just a formality to you?" John's face turned a blotchy, uneven red. He cleared his throat, but he wouldn't look me in the eye. "Mom, don't start. Alice has put a lot of work into this place. It's her vision now. Maybe you should just enjoy the wine and stay out of the business side of things. You're making people uncomfortable." That was the moment the last cord of my patience snapped. I wasn't just a guest. I was a ghost at my own table. I watched as Beatrice leaned over to me, her voice a hushed, jagged whisper. "It must be hard for you, dear, seeing them move so far beyond your station in life. But don't worry. Alice says she'll find a very nice assisted living facility for you when the time comes. Somewhere with a garden you won't have to worry about." I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I just took a slow sip of my water and looked around at the house I had scrubbed, painted, and prayed over for 40 years. I thought about the deed sitting in my safe at the bank. I thought about the fact that I hadn't yet signed the gift transfer papers I had intended to give them for Christmas. I want to ask you something, and I want you to be honest in the comments. Was I wrong for staying quiet? Some people say I should have stood up right then and ordered them out of my house. Others say that revenge is a dish best served cold, with a side of legal reality. What do you think? Was John justified in siding with his wife to keep the peace? Or is he a man who has lost his soul for a vibe? Tell me. Guilty or not guilty? Alice thought she had won. She thought she had successfully pushed the poor relative into the corner. She didn't realize that when you build your kingdom on someone else's foundation, you'd better be very careful how you treat the architect. As I drove home that night, I didn't feel sad. I felt a cold, sharp clarity. The station in life Beatrice mentioned was about to change. I wasn't going to ruin their dinner. I was going to ruin their life. The Monday morning after Thanksgiving was as sharp as a razor. I didn't spend it nursing my hurt feelings or crying over the rejected cornbread dressing. Instead, I sat at my small kitchen table with a calculator, a yellow legal pad, and my bank statements from the last 6 months. Silas always said that emotions can lie to you, but numbers never do. As I scrolled through the digital records of my savings account, I felt a familiar, steady rhythm return to my heart. It was the rhythm of a woman who was no longer playing a part in someone else's play. For years, I had ignored the late notifications. I had told myself that John was just busy, or that the young couple was finding their footing in a difficult economy. But as I looked at the screen, the truth was as clear as a bell. Alice hadn't sent a single rent-to-own payment since August. 4 months of silence. 4 months of her living in a 4-bedroom craftsman house, while I paid the property taxes and the structural insurance out of my own pocket. She wasn't just being rude, she was being a thief. She was using the money that was supposed to go toward her future ownership to buy silk jumpsuits, gray gravel, and catered meals from downtown bistros. She was financing her high society lifestyle with my retirement fund. I realized then that my son hadn't just lost his backbone, he had lost his sense of duty. He was allowing his wife to treat his mother like an interest-free loan. I closed my laptop, put on my best Sunday coat, the one with the heavy wool and the sharp lapels, and picked up my car keys. It was time to stop being Mother Vicky and start being the landlord. Mr. Sterling's office was located in a brick building that had stood in the center of town since before I was born. It smelled of old paper, floor wax, and the kind of hard-won wisdom you can't buy in a modern law school. Arthur Sterling had been Silas's closest friend for 40 years. He was a man who spoke in measured sentences and looked at the world over the top of his gold-rimmed glasses. When I walked in and laid my ledger on his desk, he didn't look surprised. He looked like he had been waiting for this day for a long time. "Vicky," he said, his voice a low rumble that reminded me of distant thunder. "I watched Silas build that house. I watched you stain the wood. I've been sitting here for 2 years, wondering when you were going to realize that Alice Morrison is a woman who treats a gift like a weakness." I told him about the gray paint. I told him about the rose bushes. I told him about the organic dinner and the assisted living comment from Beatrice. But mostly, I told him about the 4 months of missing payments. Arthur leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. "You've been more than a mother, Vicky. You've been a saint. But there is a very thin line between being a saint and being a martyr, and you've been standing on the wrong side of it for too long." He pulled a thick file from his drawer, the one containing the original deed, and the draft of the gift transfer papers I'd asked him to prepare months ago. "The law is a blunt instrument, Vicky. You have a signed occupancy agreement that stipulates the property must be maintained and payments must be current. By painting that oak and ripping out those gardens without your written consent, they've committed a breach of contract. By failing to pay, they've terminated their own right to be there." The legal tension in that office was heavy, but it wasn't the kind of tension that makes you nervous. It was the kind that makes you feel powerful. Arthur explained that because the property was still in my name, and because the rent-to-own contract had specific clauses about structural alterations, I had every right to end the arrangement immediately. Alice thought she was adding value to her home, but in the eyes of the law, she was damaging someone else's asset. "I have an offer, Arthur," I said, looking him straight in the eye. "A developer reached out to me last month. They want that corner lot on Willow Creek. They want to tear down the interior modifications and turn it into a high-end duplex. They offered me a price that would let me live the rest of my days by the ocean, without ever worrying about a bank balance again." Arthur smiled a slow, knowing grin. "And the Christmas gift you were going to give them? The deed?" "The deed stays in the safe," I replied. "I'm not signing it. I was going to give them a kingdom, but they decided to spit on the queen. If Alice wants to live like she's in a magazine, she can do it on her own dime. I want you to prepare the papers. I want a notice to vacate for non-payment." I want a termination of occupancy for unauthorized alterations, and I want them served when it will make the biggest impact. I left that office feeling lighter than I had in years. I wasn't just protecting a house, I was protecting the promise I made to Silas. I was making sure that the power he told me to keep was finally being put to use. Alice thought she was the one with the vision, but she was about to find out that a vision without a title is just a hallucination. The business side of things that John told me to stay out of was about to become the only thing that mattered. As I drove back to my apartment, I saw a billboard for a luxury car. I just laughed. Alice was about to learn that you can't drive a vibe to a new house when the owner of your current one decides the party is over. December 18th arrived with a frost that clung to the windows of my apartment like lace. Inside, my kitchen was a sanctuary of heat and holiday tradition. I was in the middle of my annual ritual, spreading a thick layer of melted white chocolate over a base of dark cocoa, then crushing peppermint canes into a fine crimson dust to sprinkle on top. It was a messy, joyful process that usually made me feel like the season had truly begun. I had already bought a small, silver ornament for the Willow Creek house, a tiny, glittering cottage with the words, "First Home" etched on the door. Despite everything, despite the gray gravel and the cold Thanksgiving dinner, I was still holding on to a sliver of hope. I was still waiting for my son to be the man Silas raised him to be. My phone buzzed on the granite counter, vibrating against a stray piece of candy cane. My heart gave a little hop, thinking it might be John calling to ask if I needed a ride to their Christmas Eve gala. I wiped my hands on my apron and picked up the device. The blue light of the screen felt unusually bright in the cozy kitchen. I read the message once. Then I read it again, the words blurring as my brain tried to make them make sense. "Mom, don't come to our house for Christmas. Alice is still very angry about what you said at Thanksgiving. She says your presence ruins the vibe of her holiday party. She's invited her whole family and some of her high society friends, and she doesn't want any drama. Just stay home. I'll bring your gifts over sometime in January. Maybe." The silence in my kitchen became heavy. The vibe, the drama. My own son was telling me that I was a social liability in a house I had built with my own sweat. He wasn't just asking for space. He was locking the door. He was choosing the approval of a woman who valued vibes over the mother who had given him the world. I stood there for a long time, watching the peppermint bark harden on the counter, realizing that the woman I used to be, the one who would have apologized just to keep the peace, was gone. I felt a heat rise in my chest, but it wasn't the frantic fire of anger. It was the steady blue flame of a furnace. I realized that Alice hadn't just stolen my son's loyalty, she had stolen his dignity. And John? He had handed it to her on a silver platter, probably hoping it would buy him a moment of quiet in a house full of gray paint and judgment. He was worried about drama at a party. He had no idea that the real drama was already written, signed, and waiting in a manila envelope on Arthur Sterling's desk. I sat down at my small kitchen table. I didn't type out a long, rambling paragraph about how much I'd sacrificed. I didn't remind him that I was the one who paid the property taxes 3 weeks ago, so the county wouldn't put a lien on his house. I didn't even mention the silver ornament sitting in the gift bag on the counter. I simply typed 3 words. "I understand, perfectly." It was the most honest thing I had ever said to him. I did understand. I understood that my son was no longer the boy who used to help me plant roses. I understood that Alice believed her silk jumpsuits and downtown catering made her invincible. And most importantly, I understood that if they wanted to live in a world where I didn't exist, they were about to get exactly what they asked for. That understanding reply wasn't a white flag of surrender. It was the sound of a trap snapping shut. It was a death warrant for every social aspiration Alice had spent the last 2 years cultivating. She wanted me out of the vibe? Fine, but she forgot that I was the one who provided the electricity, the heat, and the very walls that kept that vibe from blowing away in the winter wind. I want you to think about the power of silence for a moment. Most people think revenge is about shouting from the rooftops or making a scene in the middle of a crowded room. But there is a far more potent kind of retribution, the kind that lets the other person believe they've won, until the very second the floor drops out from under them. Alice was probably smiling at her phone right then, bragging to Beatrice about how she'd finally handled the Vicky problem. She was probably picking out which expensive wine to serve her high society friends, completely unaware that she was essentially a squatter in a house that was already being sold to a developer. Subscribe to her revenge right now, because you need to see what happens when a sweet grandma stops playing by the rules of politeness. This is the moment where the story shifts from a family drama into a lesson in real estate reality. She never saw the danger coming, and most people don't, until it's standing on their doorstep in a suit. Subscribe so you aren't the one left standing on the sidewalk while your life is packed into boxes. And for those of you who are still just watching, what would you have said in that text? Would you have gone out in a blaze of glory? Or would you have let them think they'd won? I spent the rest of that afternoon finishing my baking. I didn't cry. I didn't send an angry follow-up. I just called Arthur Sterling. "Arthur," I said, my voice as steady as the oak banisters Alice had tried to bury under gray paint. "Serve them, and make sure it happens on Christmas Eve, right when the vibe is at its peak." As the snow started to fall outside my window, I felt a peace I hadn't known since Silas passed. Alice wanted a perfect Christmas without any clutter from the past. She was about to find out that when you throw away the foundation, the whole house tends to come down with it. The countdown had begun, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one who was going to be left out in the cold. After I hung up the phone with my son, I didn't look back. I drove straight to the offices of Miller & Associates, the development firm that had been hovering around Willow Creek Lane for the better part of a year. Their office was the opposite of Alice's modern aesthetic. It was all glass, steel, and high-speed efficiency. They didn't care about vibes. They cared about square footage, zoning laws, and return on investment. The lead developer, a man named Marcus, laid out the blueprints on a wide table. He wanted to take my beautiful corner lot, the one Silas and I had cleared with our own hands, and turn it into a high-end, contemporary duplex. "We'll have to gut the interior, Mrs. Jackson," he said, tapping a pen against the schematics. "The current modifications are, well, they aren't to code for a multifamily dwelling. We'll be starting the demolition of the interior walls on the 2nd of January. I looked at the drawings. In these plans, the gray-painted banisters would be firewood. The urban pebble walls would be rubble. The floor-to-ceiling glass sunroom Alice had bragged about would never exist. I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. If Alice wanted to treat my home like a disposable fashion accessory, then I would treat it like a business asset. I signed the letter of intent right there. The sale was pending, contingent on the property being vacated by the 1st of the year. I wasn't just selling a house. I was clearing a path for my own future. I was taking the value Alice thought she had added and converting it into a bank balance that would ensure I never had to ask my son for a seat at a table ever again. With the sale in motion, I went back to Arthur Sterling to finalize the notice to vacate. We sat in his office as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, orange light across the mountains of paperwork. Arthur was thorough. He didn't just cite the 4 months of missing payments. He cited the unauthorized structural alterations to a non-owned property. In the state of Georgia, when you're in a rent-to-own agreement, you don't have the right to rip out heirloom gardens or paint over original woodwork without the express written consent of the title holder. Alice had been so arrogant, so sure of her eventual ownership, that she had bypassed every legal safeguard. She had committed thousands of dollars to renovations on a house she had no legal right to alter. "This is ironclad, Vicky," Arthur said, sliding the manila envelope across the desk. "They've breached the occupancy agreement on 3 different counts. By law, they aren't even tenants anymore. They're holdover occupants in default. We can demand immediate termination." I told him I wanted the papers served on December 24th, at 7 o'clock sharp. Arthur looked at me over his glasses, a flicker of concern in his eyes. "You know that's the night of her big party, Vicky. It's going to be a public spectacle." "I know," I replied. "Alice told me my presence would ruin the vibe. I'm just making sure the vibe she's so proud of is built on the truth. She wants to show off her estate, to her high society friends, and her boss. I want them all to see exactly what happens when you try to build a life on someone else's sacrifice. I wanted the server to arrive when the catering was out, when the champagne was flowing, and when Alice felt most invincible. I wanted the reality of her situation to hit her right in front of the people she was trying so hard to impress. Most people think that being family means you don't need a contract. They think that love is a substitute for a deed. But let me tell you something I learned the hard way. Love can be manipulated, but a title is absolute. She never saw the danger coming, and most people don't. They think their children will always have their back, or that a verbal agreement is enough to protect their life's work. I want you to take a good, hard look at your own assets right now. Do you have your name on the papers that matter? Or have you soft-signed your power away to someone who might decide you ruin their vibe tomorrow? Subscribe to Her Revenge so you're not caught off guard. We share these stories because the world is full of people like Alice who view your kindness as a weakness to be exploited. If you don't protect your legacy today, you'll be the one standing on the sidewalk tomorrow morning. Subscribe before the next twist catches you off guard. Only subscribers get the full story of how to keep their kingdom safe. If you're still not subscribing, drop a comment what's holding you back. Are you really that sure your family won't turn on you for a better vibe? I spent the days leading up to Christmas in total peace. I didn't answer John's check-in texts, which were mostly just him making sure I wasn't going to show up and embarrass him. I didn't send any cards. I just sat in my apartment, watching the snowfall, knowing that the most important gift of the season was already on its way. It wasn't wrapped in shiny paper, and it didn't have a bow. It was a thick manila envelope that was going to remind my son that his mother wasn't a cluttered relic of the past. She was the woman who owned the roof over his head. Christmas Eve on Willow Creek Lane was exactly what Alice had dreamed of. From my small apartment 2 miles away, I could almost hear the clinking of crystal and the low, curated hum of jazz. According to Beatrice, who had been peering through her curtains across the street, the driveway was a museum of luxury SUVs and German sedans. The house, my house, was glowing, with thousands of tiny white lights, casting a cold, brilliant shine over the gray gravel. Inside, Alice was in her element. She moved through the rooms like she was born to rule them, a glass of vintage champagne in one hand and a smile that looked like it had been painted on by a professional. She had spent thousands on this night. The organic catering was being served on silver platters by people in white gloves. The oak banisters, once warm and welcoming, were now cold, gray streaks behind a wall of expensive garland. She was telling her boss, a man who looked like he'd never missed a meal or a bonus, about her plans for the sunroom. "It's about the legacy," she said, her voice carrying through the room with practiced ease. "John and I feel that a property of this station requires a certain level of architectural vision. We've really made it our own, haven't we, darling?" John stood beside her, nodding like a pull-string toy. He looked tired, his eyes darting toward the door, as if he expected me to come charging in with a tray of dressing to ruin his social standing. He didn't realize that I was exactly where I wanted to be, sitting in my quiet living room, watching the clock. It was 6:55 p.m. The party was at its peak. The vibe was impenetrable. Alice was at the very top of the mountain she had built out of my husband's hard work and my own silence. At exactly 7 o'clock, the doorbell rang. It wasn't the rhythmic, cheerful chime of a neighbor or the frantic ringing of a late guest. It was a firm, rhythmic demand for attention. Alice didn't even pause her conversation. She probably thought it was the caroler she'd hired, or perhaps a delivery of more expensive wine. She glided toward the front door, her silk jumpsuit whispering against the floors Silas had sanded. She opened the door wide, a greeting already forming on her lips, her face lit by the urban pebble hallway lights. But it wasn't a guest. It was a man in a sharp, dark suit, with a face that looked like it was carved from Georgia granite. He didn't have a gift. He didn't have a tray of food. He held a thick, manila envelope that stood out against the festive decorations like a bruise on a peach. "Alice Morrison Jackson?" he asked. His voice wasn't loud, but it had a frequency that seemed to cut right through the jazz music and the laughter in the living room. Alice's smile didn't disappear. It just froze, like water turning to ice in a sudden wind. "Yes?" she said, her hand tightening on her champagne glass. "You've been served," he said, handing her the envelope. "Notice of immediate termination of occupancy for non-payment and unauthorized structural alterations to a non-owned property. You have 7 days to vacate." The legal owner has authorized the demolition of interior modifications starting January 2nd. The jazz didn't stop, but the room went suddenly, violently quiet. Alice didn't take the envelope at first. She just stared at it like it was a snake. The man didn't wait for a thank you. He turned and walked back down the steps, past the expensive cars and the white lights, leaving the door wide open to the freezing winter air. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush the lungs. Alice finally took the envelope, her fingers trembling so hard the paper rattled. She ripped it open right there in the foyer, in front of her boss, her high society friends, and her mother, Beatrice. I'm told, she let out a scream that sounded like a wounded animal, a jagged, ugly sound that had no place in her curated evening. "What is this?" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "John, what is this?" John rushed over, his face pale and blotchy. He grabbed the papers, his eyes scanning the legal language Arthur Sterling had prepared with such care. He saw the words, default, non-payment, and sale pending. He saw the name at the bottom of the deed, the only name that mattered, Vicky Jackson. The guests began to look at each other. The vibe didn't just ruin, it evaporated. People who had been admiring the grand estate minutes ago were now looking for their coats. They saw the notice to vacate in Alice's shaking hands, and realized they were standing in a house that was being repossessed by the very woman they had mocked at Thanksgiving. "Is this a joke?" Beatrice demanded, stepping forward with her glass of wine. "Alice, tell them this is a mistake. You told us you owned this place outright." Alice couldn't answer. She was looking at the guests, the people she had lied to, the people she had tried so hard to impress, and she saw the pity and the judgment in their eyes. The social capital she had spent 2 years building was gone in a heartbeat. She wasn't the queen of Willow Creek Lane anymore. She was a tenant being evicted on Christmas Eve. Pattern interrupt. One moment, it was a gala. The next, it was a crime scene. The catering staff began to pack up their trays. The music was turned off. The high society friends started making excuses about needing to get home before the snow got worse. Alice stood in the center of her gray-painted hallway, surrounded by the ruins of her vanity, while John just stood there staring at the manila envelope, as if he could make the words disappear by wishing it. They wanted me out of their Christmas. They got their wish. But as the guests filed out past the urban pebble walls, they knew the truth. The vibe wasn't ruined by me. It was ruined by the lie they had been living in. The silence in my apartment was a gift. I had spent the last hour in my armchair, the quilted blanket Silas's mother made across my knees. My phone was off. The world was quiet. I was halfway through a cup of chamomile tea when the first blow struck my front door. It wasn't a knock. It was a desperate, rhythmic pounding that rattled the frame. I didn't jump. I didn't hurry. I took one last sip of tea, set the cup down on a coaster, and smoothed my hair. I opened the door to find a scene that would have broken my heart a month ago. Now, it just felt like the final line of a long math problem. John was standing there, his face the color of old ash. Alice was behind him, her expensive silk jumpsuit stained at the hem from the slush on the street. Her makeup was smeared, her eyes wide and wet with a mix of fury and fear. In the background, I could see Beatrice sitting in their idling car, looking like she'd just watched her bank account catch fire. "Mom!" John shouted, waving the manila envelope in the cold air. "What is this? The man at the door, he said we have to leave. He said you're selling the house to a developer. You can't do this. It's Christmas Eve. For God's sake." I leaned against the door frame. The wind was biting, but I didn't feel the cold. "It is Christmas Eve, John," I said quietly. "A time for family. A time for the vibe you were so worried about. Why aren't you at your party?" Alice pushed past John, her finger shaking as she pointed it at my chest. "You senile old woman. You told us this was our home. I've spent $40,000 on those renovations. I've built a life in those walls. You promised us." I didn't flinch. I just looked at her. Really looked at her. "I promised my son a legacy, Alice. I didn't promise a thief a playground. You didn't build a life. You built a stage. And you built it with money that belonged to my retirement fund. You stopped sending the rent-to-own installments in August. Did you think I wouldn't notice? Did you think I was too cluttered in the head to check my own bank statements?" The color drained from Alice's face. She looked at John, then back at me. "We were. We were investing in the property value. It's the same thing. It isn't the same thing, I replied. My voice was flat and hard. In the state of Georgia, real estate agreements must be in writing to be enforceable. You wanted to play the high society homeowner, but you never bothered to check the deed. You never signed the final transfer because you were too busy ripping out my grandmother's roses. You breached the occupancy agreement the moment you touched those oak banisters, without my consent. You aren't owners. You're tenants in default. And as of 7 o'clock tonight, you aren't even that. John's voice cracked. Mom, please. The developer's notice says they're starting the demolition on the 2nd. Everything Alice built. It'll be gone. Everything Alice built was done to a house she didn't own with money she didn't have. I said, you chose her vision over your father's work. Now you can live with the view. This is the part where people expect the mother to give in. They expect the sweet grandma to open the door, offer a warm bed, and forget the months of insults. But why should I care about their comfort when they didn't care about my dignity? Alice had told her mother she was going to put me in an assisted living facility. She had told me I ruined the atmosphere of her life. Vicky! Alice let out a desperate cry, her voice rising to a screech. Where are we supposed to sleep tonight? Every hotel in the city is booked for the holiday. My parents are in the car. You can't leave us on the street. I looked at my son. He looked small. He looked like a man who had traded his soul for a vibe and found out the currency was worthless. I suppose you should have thought about that before you told the owner of the roof over your head to stay away, I said. John, I spent my life building a kingdom for you, but I won't let you use that kingdom to keep me in the cold. You chose her family's approval over your mother's heart. So, go ahead, spend Christmas with them. I hear the bistro downtown has excellent leftovers. Alice stepped forward, her mouth open to scream another insult, but I didn't give her the chance. I didn't need to hear another word of her modern wisdom. Happy birthday, Jesus, I whispered. I shut the door. I turned the deadbolt, the heavy brass one Silas had installed 40 years ago. I heard Alice's muffled scream from the hallway. I heard John's low, defeated voice trying to quiet her. Then, I heard their footsteps retreating down the hall. I walked back to my armchair, picked up my tea, and sat in the silence. It was the most peaceful Christmas Eve I had enjoyed in a decade. The weight was gone. The vibe was finally, truly mine. The first week of January was a blur of signatures and moving trucks. I didn't go back to the house on Willow Creek Lane to watch the demolition crew arrive. I didn't need to see the urban pebble walls being knocked into piles of rubble or the gray gravel being hauled away. My neighbor, Beatrice the kind one, not Alice's mother, called me on the 2nd to tell me the sound of the sledgehammers was echoing all the way down the block. She said it sounded like the heartbeat of the neighborhood was finally starting back up. Marcus and his development firm were efficient. They didn't care about the silk wallpaper or the curated light fixtures. To them, those were just obstacles in the way of a more profitable future. The sale closed on the 15th. When the final wire transfer hit my bank account, I sat in my small apartment and stared at the numbers on the screen. It was more money than Silas and I had earned in our first 20 years of marriage combined. It was the price of 40 years of sweat, 4 months of betrayal, and one final, ironclad no. I didn't feel a sting of regret as I packed my own bags. I wasn't taking much, just the mahogany sideboard, my grandmother's old quilts, and the silver ornament that had never made it onto the tree. I left the peppermint bark on the counter for the next tenant. As I drove out of the city for the last time, I passed the entrance to Willow Creek. The oak trees were still there, standing tall and indifferent to the drama of the humans below. I realized then that a house is just a container. You can paint it, you can strip it, and you can fill it with people who don't deserve it. But the land? The land is the only thing that holds the truth. I was leaving the dirt behind, but I was taking the power Silas told me to keep. 3 months later, the air smells of salt and cedar instead of red clay and pine. I bought a small villa by the ocean, a place where the sun sets over the water in a riot of orange and violet that no modern designer could ever hope to replicate. There is no gray paint here. My banisters are polished driftwood, and my garden is a wild, beautiful tangle of sea oats and stubborn coastal flowers that don't need a clipboard to grow. I hear news of John and Alice through the grapevine of old friends. It turns out that when the grand estate disappeared, so did Alice's high society friends. Her boss didn't find the eviction vibe very professional. Beatrice, the perfume-heavy one, wasn't quite so eager to host them, once she realized there was no guest suite and no floor-to-ceiling sunroom to brag about. Last I heard, they were living in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment near the airport. It's loud, it's small, and I imagine the vibe is a bit more reality-based than Alice would like. John calls me sometimes. His voice sounds older, thinner. He talks about the weather and asks if I need anything, but he never mentions the house. He never asks for money. I think, in the quiet moments between the roar of the planes overhead, he's finally starting to feel the heat of the work he refused to do. He's realizing that you can't live off the scraps of a legacy you weren't willing to protect. I love my son, and I always will, but I'm no longer his safety net. I'm a woman who has finally learned that being a mother doesn't mean being a doormat. Sometimes, the greatest act of love you can show a child is to let them feel the weight of their own choices. If he ever wants to build something real, he knows where to find the tools. But the keys? Those stay with me. As I sit here on my porch, watching the waves roll in, I think about all the other Vickies out there. I think about the women who are being told they're cluttered or outdated by people who haven't even learned how to pay a property tax bill. I want this story to be a reminder to you. Your kindness is a gift, not an obligation. Your history is a foundation, not a relic to be painted over by someone who wants the look of success without the sacrifice of the mortgage. Sometimes, people need to lose a palace to realize they never deserved the throne. If you've ever had to take back your power from someone who didn't respect it, I want you to comment the word loyalty below. Let's show the world that we are a tribe of people who know our value. We are the ones who built the walls, and we are the ones who have the right to decide who gets to stay warm inside them. If you haven't subscribed to Her Revenge yet, ask yourself why. Are you waiting for your own foundation to be pulled out from under you? Or are you ready to learn how to keep your kingdom safe? We're building a community here of people who refuse to be erased. Subscribe so you can stay informed, stay protected, and stay ahead of the predators who think they can outsmart a lifetime of wisdom. And if you're still holding back, tell me in the comments, would you have given John a second chance? Or was I right to shut the door for good? The sun is going down now, and the light is reflecting off the ocean in a way that makes the whole world look like it's made of gold. I think about Silas, and I think about that red dirt in Georgia. I think about the smile I had at my kitchen table on December 18th. It wasn't a happy smile, but it was a satisfied one. Because at the end of the day, when the vibe fades and the party guests go home, the only thing that matters is who owns the ground you're standing on. I took my power back, and every time I look at the horizon, I just smile.